The security guard's hand was already on Marcus Chen's shoulder when the flash went off. Someone in the back of the chapel had taken a photo, catching the exact moment when shame became public, when grief became trespass, when a man in a janitor's uniform was being escorted from a funeral he had no business attending. That's where we need to start. With the hand on the shoulder. With the whispers rippling through the pews. With a 6-year-old boy named Tommy clutching his father's leg and asking why the big man was touching Daddy. But let me back up. Let me tell you how Marcus got there in the first place. Eastwood Memorial Chapel sat on the kind of street where the trees were old and the money older. Marcus had walked past it 1,000 times on his way to the metro station, always noticing the well-dressed mourners, the black town cars, the flower arrangements that cost more than his monthly rent. He never imagined he would be inside. Never imagined he would need to be. The obituary had been small. Just a few lines in the business section, easy to miss if you weren't looking. Eleanor Whitmore, age 78, philanthropist and former board member of Whitmore Industries, survived by her son, billionaire tech entrepreneur James Whitmore. Service is private. Marcus had read those words on his phone during his lunch break, sitting on an upturned bucket in the maintenance closet at Hillcrest Towers, and something inside him had cracked open. Private services. As if grief could be made exclusive. As if some people's mourning counted more than others. He had known Eleanor Whitmore for exactly 4 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Not that he had been counting. Not that he had marked each conversation, each small kindness, each moment when she had treated him like a human being instead of part of the building's fixtures. It started the way these things always start. With a spill in the lobby, with Marcus on his knees mopping up coffee at 6 in the morning, invisible in his gray uniform. Eleanor had stepped carefully around his work, then paused. Most residents walked through him like he was made of air, but she had stopped and apologized for the mess, even though it wasn't hers. She had asked his name. She had remembered it the next time. Small things. A smile when she saw him changing light bulbs in the hallway. A question about his day that seemed genuine. Once, when she saw him studying from a textbook during his break, she had asked what he was learning. Computer programming, he had told her, embarrassed. Night classes when he could afford them. Trying to build something better for Tommy. She had lit up at that. Her son was in tech, she said. Maybe someday Marcus could work for a company like his. It was the kind of thing people said without thinking, the kind of empty encouragement that cost nothing. Except Eleanor had meant it. A week later, she had left a stack of programming books outside his maintenance closet with a note. These were gathering dust in my apartment. Someone should use them. For 4 years, that's how it went. Small conversations in hallways. Books left like gifts. Once, when Tommy was sick and Marcus had to bring him to work because he couldn't afford daycare, Eleanor had sat with the feverish boy in the lobby for 20 minutes, reading him stories from a magazine while Marcus fixed a leak on the 14th floor. When he came back down, Tommy was laughing. Eleanor was teaching him to fold the magazine pages into paper airplanes. You have a good son, she had told Marcus. Is going to do wonderful things. Marcus had believed her because she said it like she could see the future. Like she knew something he didn't about how the world worked. About how people like Tommy could rise above circumstances, about how kindness could be a ladder instead of just a word. And now she was dead, and they were calling her services private. Marcus had stood outside the chapel for 15 minutes before going in, Tommy's hand sweating in his own. He knew what he looked like. He had come straight from work because he couldn't afford to miss a shift, even for this. His uniform was clean but worn thin at the elbows. His shoes had been resoled twice. Tommy's coat was 2 sizes too big, a hammer-down from the donation bin at the community center. It didn't belong here. Marcus knew that. But Eleanor had belonged to him too, in some small way. She had seen him. That had to count for something. The chapel was half full when they slipped into the back pew. Marcus kept his head down, kept Tommy quiet with a coloring book and broken crayons. He just wanted to say goodbye. He just wanted to be there for 10 minutes, to hear whatever words people said about her, to carry those words back out into his life like proof that the kindness had been real. Then James Whitmore walked in. Marcus had seen him before, of course. In the building, moving through the lobby with his security detail and his expensive suits, never making eye contact with the staff. Eleanor's son, the one who had made billions in artificial intelligence, who appeared on magazine covers, who lived in the penthouse that Marcus was not allowed to service. Different cleaners handled the top floor. People who had been vetted. People who had passed background checks and signed non-disclosure agreements. People who were not Marcus. James sat in the front row, surrounded by executives and lawyers and people who looked like they measured their worth in stock options. The service began. A minister talked about Eleanor's charitable work, her grace, her devotion to family. No one mentioned the paper airplanes. No one mentioned the books left outside maintenance closets. No one mentioned the night she had stayed late in the lobby, talking to a janitor about his dreams for 2 hours, making him believe those dreams could be real. Marcus felt Tommy shift beside him, felt the boy's confusion at his father's tears. He pulled his son closer and tried to breathe through the grief that was pressing on his chest like a physical weight. That's when he saw it. The photograph on the memorial table at the front of the chapel. A young Eleanor, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing in front of a house with a garden. She was holding a book and grinning at the camera, her whole life ahead of her, her whole self visible in that smile. Marcus had seen that photograph before. 2 years ago, Eleanor had been frantic in the lobby, searching her purse, checking her coat pockets, asking if anyone had seen a small photograph in a silver frame. It was the only picture she had from her childhood home. She had explained. Before the fire, before her parents died, the frame had broken and she had taken the photo out to have it copied, but now she couldn't find the original anywhere. She was nearly in tears. Marcus had found it 3 days later, wedged behind the mailboxes in the lobby. The corner was torn, the image faded, but it was hers. She had cried when he returned it. Actually cried. She had pressed it to her chest like it was made of gold. And now it was here, displayed at her funeral, perfectly restored and professionally mounted. Except Marcus was holding the original in his pocket. He pulled it out slowly, hands shaking. The torn corner, the faded colors, the way Eleanor had looked that day when he gave it back to her, the way she had said thank you like he had saved her life instead of just finding a lost photograph. She had given it to him 6 months ago, on one of the last good days before she got sick. Keep this safe for me, she had said, in case I forget where I put things. In case I need to remember who I was before I became all of this. She had gestured vaguely at the expensive building, at the life she had lived. You understand about holding on to the past. I can see it in how you talk about Tommy's mother. Marcus had taken the photograph because she asked him to, because she trusted him with it, because in that moment, she had made him feel like a guardian instead of just hired help. Now someone at the funeral had displayed what must be a copy. A perfect restoration that erased the damage, that made the memory clean and professional and suitable for public viewing. But the real photograph, the one that mattered, the one she had clutched in her failing hands, was in Marcus's pocket. He stood up. He didn't think about it. He just stood up, Tommy confused beside him, and he started walking toward the front of the chapel. He needed to tell someone. He needed them to know that they had the wrong photograph on display. He needed them to understand that Eleanor had wanted the torn one, the real one, the one that showed time and love and all the careful handling that came from actually mattering to someone. He made it halfway down the aisle before the security guard grabbed his shoulder. This is where we came in. The hand on the shoulder, the whispers, the flash of a camera phone catching the moment when Marcus became an intruder at a funeral where everyone but him had been invited by name. Sir, you need to leave. The guard's voice was professional but firm, loud enough to carry. I just need to show someone something, Marcus said. His voice cracked. About the photograph. I have the real one. She gave it to me. James Whitmore turned around in the front pew. His face was blank at first, then confused, then something harder. He stood up and walked back toward Marcus, every eye in the chapel following him. From up close, Marcus could see that James had been crying. His eyes were red. His composure was a shell held together by force of will. He looked at Marcus the way you look at a problem that has appeared in the wrong place at the wrong time. Who are you? James asked. Marcus Chen. I'm the janitor at Hillcrest Towers. Your mother and I, we were friends. She gave me this. He held out the photograph with a trembling hand. James glanced at it, then at Marcus, then at Tommy clutching his father's leg. His expression didn't change. "Security, please escort this man and his child out of the building. Now." "But she gave me this. She wanted me to keep it safe. I just wanted you to know that the photograph up there, it's not the one she cared about. This is the one she cared about. My mother wouldn't have given you anything. I don't know what you're trying to do here, but this is not the time or place." James turned back toward the front of the chapel, dismissing Marcus with the gesture. The security guard's grip tightened on Marcus's shoulder. Another guard appeared, flanking his other side. Together they walked him back down the aisle, Tommy running to keep up. The boy's face twisted with fear and confusion. The whispers grew louder. Someone muttered something about inappropriate. Someone else said security risk. A woman near the door pulled out her phone, filming as Marcus was removed, making sure to get his face, his uniform, the way Tommy was crying now. Outside, the guards let go but stayed close, making sure Marcus left the property. The door to the chapel closed behind them with a sound like a vault ceiling. Marcus stood on the sidewalk, holding Tommy, holding the photograph, feeling the weight of every eye that had watched him be thrown out of a place where he never should have gone in the first place. "Daddy, why did they make us leave?" Tommy's voice was small and scared. "Did we do something bad?" Marcus couldn't answer. He just held his son and looked at the photograph in his hand. Eleanor at 7 years old, grinning at the camera, holding a book, standing in front of a garden that had burned down before she was 10. The corner was torn where it had been wedged behind the mailboxes. The colors were faded from years of being carried and touched and remembered. "No, buddy," Marcus finally said. "We didn't do anything bad." But as he walked away from the chapel, carrying his son, pocketing the photograph, feeling the shame burn through him like acid, Marcus wasn't sure he believed his own words. Maybe he had done something bad. Maybe wanting to be seen, wanting to matter, wanting his grief to count, was its own kind of trespass. Maybe Eleanor's kindness had been just that, kindness, and he had mistaken it for something more. Maybe the photograph in his pocket was proof of nothing except his own desperate need to believe that he mattered to someone in a world that kept teaching him he didn't. The story should end there, with Marcus walking away, lesson learned, knowing his place. But here's the thing about truth. Sometimes it finds you even when you're not looking for it. Sometimes it arrives in forms you don't expect. Sometimes the people with the power to make things right are the same people who made things wrong in the first place. James Whitmore stood at the front of the chapel after Marcus was removed, trying to focus on the minister's words, trying to ignore the whispers that hadn't quite died down. But he couldn't stop seeing the photograph that Janitor had held up. The torn corner, the faded colors. His mother had lost a photograph like that once. Years ago, she had been devastated when the frame broke and then the photo itself disappeared. She had searched everywhere. James had hired a restoration service to recreate it from an old copy. The one on display at the funeral was perfect, professionally done. Every detail preserved and enhanced. But it wasn't the original. And his mother had been very clear, in those last confused weeks before she died, about something she had given to her friend Marcus to keep safe. James had assumed she was confused, talking about someone from her past, mixing up memories. He hadn't thought to ask questions. He certainly hadn't thought his mother would befriend the building's janitor. But now, standing in the chapel, James thought about the expression on that man's face. The way he had held the photograph like it was precious. The way he had said, "She gave it to me," like it was a fact that mattered, like it meant something. What if his mother really had given that janitor her most treasured photograph? What if James had just thrown out the one person at this funeral who had actually known Eleanor Whitmore, instead of just knowing about her? The question lodged itself in James's mind and refused to leave. After the service ended, after the reception, after the last guest departed and James was alone in the chapel with just his head of security, he made a decision. "Find out who that man was," James said. "The janitor, Marcus Chen. I want to know everything about him. Where he lives, where he works, whether his story about my mother checks out. Everything." The head of security nodded. "So, if he's been harassing your mother or trying to extort the family." "Just find him," James interrupted. "Let me decide what happens next." What happened next would change both their lives in ways neither man could predict. But that part of the story comes later. Right now, we need to talk about where Marcus was watching from. Sitting on a bench 3 blocks away from the chapel, Tommy is asleep against his shoulder, the photograph still in his pocket, wondering if Eleanor Whitmore had ever really existed at all or if he had imagined the whole thing. If you're watching this story unfold from somewhere in the world, maybe you can relate to that feeling. That sense of being invisible, of wondering if the connections you make matter to anyone but you, of hoping that kindness is real even when the world keeps proving otherwise. Leave a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Sometimes it helps to know we're not alone in this, that somewhere out there, someone else understands what it means to be seen and then forgotten, to matter and then not matter, to hold proof of something real in your hands and have nobody believe you. Marcus sat on that bench until the sun started to set, until Tommy woke up hungry and confused, until the chapel behind them went dark and empty. Then he stood up, adjusted his son on his hip, and started the long walk home to an apartment where the heat didn't work and the dreams he had once believed in felt very far away. The photograph stayed in his pocket. The question of whether any of it had been real stayed in his heart. And across the city, in a penthouse office, James Whitmore was making phone calls, pulling files, starting an investigation into a janitor he had dismissed without a second thought. Truth, when it starts to surface, doesn't ask permission. It just comes. To understand what happened next, you need to know where Marcus came from. Not just the surface details, the resume facts, but the real story. The one that explained why a man with a computer science degree was mopping floors at 41 years old. The one that explained the wariness in his eyes, the way he apologized for existing, the careful, invisible way he moved through the world. 18 months before Eleanor Whitmore's funeral, Marcus had been different. Not wealthy, never that, but hopeful in a way that felt sustainable. He had been married to Lily, a nurse who laughed easily and believed in second chances. Together they had built a small life in a small apartment in Queens, raising Tommy, making plans. Marcus worked as a junior programmer at a mid-sized firm. The pay was modest but steady. They were building something. Then Lily got sick. It started with fatigue she blamed on long shifts. Then came the bruising that wouldn't heal, the infections that kept returning, the blood tests that led to more blood tests that led finally to 3 words that changed everything. Acute myeloid leukemia. The treatment was aggressive. The insurance coverage was not. Within 6 months, Marcus and Lily had burned through their savings, maxed out their credit cards, borrowed from everyone they knew. The hospital bills came like an avalanche, each one bigger than the last, each one carrying the weight of a life they couldn't afford to save. Lily died on a Tuesday morning in March while Tommy was at school and Marcus was at work, trying to keep his job, trying to keep the insurance that was supposed to cover treatment that hadn't worked anyway. He got the call at his desk. He left immediately. By the time he arrived at the hospital, she was already gone. The funeral cost $8,000 they didn't have. The remaining medical bills totaled over $200,000. Marcus tried to hold on. He went back to work, made arrangements for Tommy, functioned in the mechanical way people do when grief is too big to process. But the medical debt collectors started calling within weeks. His wages were garnished. His credit was destroyed. And then, 3 months after Lily died, his company announced layoffs. Marcus's position was eliminated. He lost his job, his income, and his insurance in a single day. At 40 years old, widowed and broke and responsible for a 5-year-old child, Marcus discovered something about the American economy. There are no second chances at the bottom. Not really. Not when your credit score is wrecked, your job history has a gap, your references are shaky because you missed work for medical emergencies. Not when you need flexible hours to care for a grieving child, when you can't afford professional clothes or reliable transportation, when every job application asks questions that make your life sound like a series of red flags. He applied to programmer positions and got no responses. He applied to retail and got turned down for being overqualified. He applied to restaurants and warehouses and call centers and heard nothing. The unemployment benefits ran out. The eviction notice came. Tommy started having nightmares. Marcus took the first job he could get, Night janitor at Hillcrest Towers, 5 p.m. to 1 a.m., $9 an hour, no benefits. It was work. It was something. It kept them housed in a basement studio apartment in the building, a perk for maintenance staff, a room that smelled like mildew and had bars on the single window but was still better than a shelter. That's where he was when he met Eleanor Whitmore, working a job that paid less than a third of what he had made as a programmer, living in a room that felt like a cave, parenting a traumatized child alone, trying to make sense of how life had turned into this. Eleanor's kindness had meant everything because it was the first time in months anyone had treated Marcus like he was still human. The books she left were the first new things that had come into his life that weren't bills or notices or reminders of failure. The conversations they had were the first time someone asked him about his dreams instead of his debts. She made him believe that the janitor job was temporary, that the programming skills were still valuable, that someday he would climb back up to where he had been and maybe even higher. She made Tommy laugh on the days when the boy was silent and scared. She saw them both when the rest of the building looked through them like glass. And now she was dead, and her son had thrown Marcus out of her funeral, and the photograph in his pocket felt like the last piece of evidence that any of it had been real. The morning after the funeral, Marcus went to work because he didn't know what else to do. He arrived at 5 p.m., clocked in, put on his gray uniform, and started his shift, mopping the lobby, emptying the trash, cleaning the elevators, moving through the building like a ghost. By 7 p.m., the building manager called him into the office. Her name was Patricia Kent, a sharp-faced woman in her 50s who managed Hillcrest Towers with the efficiency of someone who had never been on the losing side of a power dynamic. She sat behind a desk and looked at Marcus like he was a problem to be solved. There was an incident yesterday, she said without preamble, at Eleanor Whitmore's funeral. Marcus felt his stomach drop. I can explain. You disrupted a private service. You upset the family. There are photographs circulating online of you being removed by security. She turned her computer monitor so Marcus could see. The image was clear. Marcus in his janitor's uniform, being escorted out of the chapel, Tommy crying, the grief and shame visible on his face. The caption read, "Disturbed man crashes billionaire's mother's funeral. Claims to have relationship with deceased." I didn't crash it, Marcus said quietly. Mrs. Whitmore and I were friends. I just wanted to pay my respects. Mrs. Whitmore was a resident of this building. You are an employee. There's a difference. Patricia folded her hands on her desk. The Whitmore family has expressed concerns about your behavior. Given your access to the building, your presence in resident spaces, we can't afford to have someone on staff who makes residents uncomfortable. The words hung in the air like a blade. I've never made anyone uncomfortable. I do my job. I keep to myself. I've never had a complaint. Until now. Patricia's voice was firm. I'm sorry, Marcus, but we're going to have to let you go. Effective immediately. You'll receive 2 weeks' pay. You'll need to be out of your apartment by the end of the month. The room tilted. Marcus gripped the arms of his chair. I have a son. I can't afford to lose this job. Please, if I said something wrong at the funeral, if I upset anyone, I apologize. It won't happen again. Just let me keep working. The decision is final. Patricia stood up, signaling the meeting was over. Security will escort you out. You can collect your personal items from the maintenance closet on your way. Marcus left the office in a daze. The security guard who followed him to the maintenance closet was the same one who had removed him from the funeral. Neither man spoke. Marcus packed his few belongings, his textbooks, the photograph of Lily he kept in his locker, his spare uniform. It fit in a single backpack. Tommy was at the after-school program that Marcus could no longer afford. Marcus would have to pick him up soon and figure out how to explain that they were losing their home, that Daddy had lost another job, that the safe place they had built in the basement of this building was being taken away. He walked out of Hillcrest Towers at 7:30 p.m., 24 hours after Eleanor Whitmore's funeral, carrying everything he owned in a backpack, trying to breathe through the panic that was closing his throat. The rent was due in 5 days. He had $214 in his bank account. The 2-week severance pay would maybe cover 1 month's rent at a new place, if he could find anyone willing to rent to an unemployed janitor with bad credit and a dependent child. The after-school program cost $60 a week, Money he didn't have. Tommy's asthma medication cost $90 a month. Also money he didn't have. Marcus sat on the steps outside the building and tried to make a plan. Apply for emergency assistance. Call the community center about food programs. Look for day labor work that would let him keep Tommy with him. Sell everything that wasn't essential. Figure it out hour by hour because thinking in longer increments made the panic worse. His phone buzzed. A text from Tommy's after-school program. Tommy seems upset today. Didn't want to participate. Can you come in early to pick him up? Marcus closed his eyes. Of course Tommy was upset. The boy had watched his father get thrown out of a funeral yesterday. Had slept in a bed in an apartment they were about to lose. Had woken up this morning in the arms of a father who was trying to hold together a life that kept breaking into smaller and smaller pieces. At the community center, Marcus found Tommy sitting alone in a corner, coloring with fierce concentration. The picture was of their apartment, the tiny basement studio. In the drawing, Tommy had added a garden outside the window, flowers and trees that didn't exist in the concrete alley where their single window faced. Ready to go, buddy? Marcus asked, kneeling down. Tommy looked up. His eyes were puffy, like he had been crying. Are we in trouble? No, sweetheart. We're not in trouble. Then why did we have to leave the church? Why were those men touching you? Marcus pulled Tommy into his lap. The boy was 6 years old, too young to understand death, debt, class, the invisible rules that governed who belonged where. Too young to understand why his father's kindness to a wealthy woman had somehow been interpreted as trespass, why grief had no universal language, why being poor made you suspicious even when you were just trying to mourn someone you loved. Remember how I told you that Mrs. Whitmore died? The nice lady who read you stories in the lobby. Marcus kept his voice steady. The church yesterday, that was where people said goodbye to her. But some of the people there didn't know that Mrs. Whitmore and I were friends. They thought I shouldn't be there, so they asked me to leave. But you were her friend. You told them that. I did, but sometimes grown-ups don't listen very well. Tommy was quiet for a moment, processing. Then, is that why we have to move? Marcus's breath caught. How did you know we have to move? I heard you on the phone this morning, talking about finding a new place. About money. Tommy's voice got very small. Did I do something wrong? Did I cost too much money again? The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Again, when had his 6-year-old son started to believe he cost too much money? When had Tommy learned to blame himself for poverty, for loss, for the circumstances that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with a healthcare system that bankrupted families and an economy that punished people for getting sick? Tommy, look at me. Marcus cupped his son's face in his hands. You have never, not once, not ever, done anything wrong. You are the best thing in my whole life. You are not too expensive. You are not a burden. Do you understand me? Tommy nodded, but his eyes said he didn't quite believe it. They walked home through the cold December evening, Marcus carrying his backpack of belongings, Tommy holding his hand. The basement apartment was exactly as they had left it that morning. The air mattress on the floor, the hot plate on top of the mini-fridge, the clothes folded in cardboard boxes because they had never unpacked from the last time they moved. It looked like a place people stayed temporarily, because that's what it was. Marcus made dinner from the food they had left: rice, canned vegetables, peanut butter sandwiches. Tommy ate in silence, pushing food around his plate. After dinner, Marcus tried to do what he always did: maintain routine, create normalcy. Bath time. Story time. Lights out by 8:30 because Tommy had school tomorrow and Marcus had to spend the night applying for jobs, calling landlords, figuring out their next move. But Tommy couldn't sleep. He lay on the air mattress next to Marcus, staring at the ceiling, his small body rigid with worry. Daddy. Yeah, buddy. When Mommy died, you said she was watching over us from heaven. Do you think Mrs. Whitmore is watching over us too? Marcus felt tears burn behind his eyes. I think so. I think she would want to make sure we're okay. Then why isn't she helping us? Why did her son make us leave? Why don't the people who can help actually help? It was the most devastating question Tommy had ever asked, because it had no good answer. Why didn't the people with resources and power help the people without? Why did kindness exist in private moments but disappear in public ones? Why did death bring people together unless those people were from different worlds? In which case death just revealed how separate those worlds really were. I don't know, Tommy, Marcus said honestly. I wish I did. Tommy rolled over, tucking himself against his father's side. I miss Mommy. I miss Mrs. Whitmore. I miss our old apartment. The one with the bathtub and the Royale bed. I know. I miss those things too. Will we ever get them back? Marcus wanted to say yes. He wanted to promise that things would get better, that the job loss was temporary, that they would find a new place, that eventually they would climb back up to stable ground. But the promises felt hollow in his mouth. Lies he had told before that hadn't come true. I'm going to try my hardest, he said instead. That's all I can promise. That I will try. Tommy fell asleep eventually, his breathing evening out, his small hand clutching his father's shirt. Marcus lay awake for hours, listening to the pipes rattle in the walls, feeling the dampness seep through the thin mattress, trying to figure out how to keep his son fed and housed and safe with no job, no savings, no backup plan, and no one to call who could help. The photograph of Eleanor was still in his jacket pocket. Marcus pulled it out and looked at it in the dim light coming through the barred window. The 7-year-old girl grinning at the camera, holding a book, standing in a garden that would burn. She hadn't known what was coming. None of us do. The fire, the loss, the long life she would build afterward, the kindness she would show to a janitor decades later, the son who would grow up to become a billionaire who didn't recognize his own mother's compassion reflected in a stranger. Marcus put the photograph on the cardboard box that served as their nightstand. Eleanor watching over them. The patron saint of people who got thrown out of places they didn't belong. The next morning, Marcus woke up to find Tommy staring at the photograph. She had a nice smile, the boy said. Yeah, Marcus agreed. She did. Do you think she knows you got fired because of her funeral? Marcus didn't answer right away. He made breakfast, got Tommy ready for school, walked him to the bus stop. Only when they were standing on the corner, waiting for the yellow bus to appear, did he say, Mrs. Whitmore would be very sad if she knew. She would want to fix it. But she can't. Because she's dead. Right. Because she's dead. The bus came. Tommy climbed aboard. Marcus watched it pull away, carrying his son to a school day full of normal things, math and recess and lunch, while Marcus walked back to the apartment to spend the day trying to salvage a life that felt like it was actively working to destroy itself. He applied for 15 jobs that morning. He called 12 landlords. He researched emergency assistance programs, food banks, free clinics. He made a list of everything they owned that could be sold. It wasn't much. Lily's wedding ring, already pawned. The laptop, old and slow. Some clothes. The textbooks Eleanor had given him, worth maybe $60 at the used bookstore. By noon, Marcus had a headache that felt like an ice pick behind his eyes. By 2 p.m., his phone had died because he couldn't pay the bill. By 4 p.m., he realized he had no way to contact Tommy's school if there was an emergency, no way for potential employers to call him back, no way to exist in a world that required constant connectivity. He walked to the library to use their internet, logged into his email to find rejection letters from 3 of the jobs he had applied for that morning. Automated responses. We regret to inform you. We've decided to pursue other candidates. We wish you luck in your search. The library closed at 6. Marcus picked up Tommy from after-school care, explaining that his phone wasn't working, that they might have a new phone number soon, that things were complicated right now but would get better. Tommy nodded like he understood, but his eyes were scared. They ate dinner from the food pantry donations. Canned soup, stale crackers, an apple that was starting to bruise. Tommy didn't complain. He never complained. That's what broke Marcus's heart the most. The way his 6-year-old son had learned that complaining changed nothing, that you just ate what you got and were grateful it was anything at all. That night, as Tommy was falling asleep, he said, Daddy, you know how you said you would try your hardest to make things better? Yeah. What if your hardest isn't enough? Marcus didn't have an answer for that either. But sitting here now, telling you this story, watching you witness this moment in their lives, maybe that's part of trying. Maybe letting people see what poverty actually looks like, what losing a job really means, what falling through the cracks feels like from the inside. Maybe that's how we start to change things. If you're still with me, if this story matters to you, I need you to do something. Leave a comment below and let me know you're here. Click that like button if this is resonating with you. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Because I promise you, what comes next is going to matter. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it, who needs to understand that the people we walk past every day have stories like this, full and complex and devastating and real. And check the description below for resources if you or someone you know is going through something similar. Because you're not alone in this, even when it feels like you are. Marcus and Tommy fell asleep that night in their basement apartment that would stop being theirs in 3 weeks. The photograph of Eleanor watched over them from a cardboard box. The world outside kept turning, indifferent to their struggle, unaware that across the city a billionaire was conducting an investigation that would reveal truths neither man was prepared for. But that part comes later. Right now, we're still in the falling part of the story, and Marcus hadn't hit bottom yet. Across Manhattan, in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, James Whitmore sat at his desk reviewing the file his head of security had compiled on Marcus Chen. The folder was surprisingly thick for a man who was supposed to be nobody. Marcus Chen, age 41. Widower. Father to Tommy Chen, age 6. Previously employed as a junior software engineer at DataStream Solutions. Terminated in June 2023 during company-wide layoffs. Currently, or rather formerly, employed as a custodial worker at Hillcrest Towers. Terminated December 18, 2024, following incident at Eleanor Whitmore funeral. But it was the details beneath those bare facts that made James pause. Wife Lily Chen, deceased March 2023, acute myeloid leukemia. Medical expenses totaling $207,000, of which $183,000 remained unpaid. Wages garnished. Credit destroyed. Bankruptcy filed and denied due to technical errors in paperwork. 3 evictions in 18 months. Current residence. Basement studio at Hillcrest Towers. Employee housing. Set for termination of lease December 31st. James turned the page. Educational history. Bachelor's degree in computer science from City College. Graduated with honors. Dean's List 4 years. Scholarship recipient. Thesis on machine learning algorithms that, according to the security report, had been cited in several academic papers. This wasn't a disturbed man. This wasn't a stalker or con artist. This was a programmer who had fallen through the cracks. James flipped to the next section. Character references from Marcus's former employer. Excellent worker, dedicated, creative problem solver, unfortunate victim of downsizing. From Tommy's school. Father deeply involved despite work constraints. Child well cared for despite obvious financial hardship. From neighbors at previous residences. Quiet, respectful, kept to himself, good with his kid. And then, near the back of the folder, James found what he was looking for. Security footage from Hillcrest Towers. The timestamp showed dates spanning 4 years. His security team had pulled every instance where Marcus Chen and Eleanor Whitmore appeared in the same frame. James plugged in his headphones and started watching. The first clip, Eleanor dropping her keys in the lobby, Marcus immediately crossing the space to pick them up and return them. She smiled. She thanked him by name. The interaction lasted 40 seconds. The second clip, Eleanor sitting in the lobby at 6 a.m., unusually early, looking distressed. Marcus approaching during his shift, asking if she was all right. She gestured at her phone, clearly upset about something. Marcus listened, nodded, disappeared into the maintenance closet and returned with tea from his personal thermos. They sat together for 12 minutes. The third clip, Tommy, younger than, maybe 4 years old, sitting on the lobby floor while Marcus cleaned. Eleanor arriving home, seeing the child, sitting down to talk to him, making him laugh. Marcus returning from taking out trash, seeing them together, his face transforming with relief and gratitude. Eleanor standing, saying something to Marcus, touching his shoulder briefly. The gesture of someone offering comfort. James watched clip after clip. Eleanor bringing books down to the lobby, handing them to Marcus. Marcus showing Eleanor something on his phone, probably photographs of Tommy. Eleanor crying in the lobby late one night. Marcus sitting with her for over an hour. Just sitting, not saying much, just being present. His mother, alone in the building where James had installed her after his father died, finding companionship with the janitor because James himself was always too busy to visit. The realization settled over James like cold water. His mother had been lonely, desperately, achingly lonely in the expensive apartment he had bought her, in the building full of wealthy residents who probably never spoke to her. And she had found friendship with the man who cleaned the floors because that man had seen her as a person rather than as a billionaire's mother. There was one more clip, dated 6 months before Eleanor's death, when she was already getting confused, already forgetting things. The footage showed her in the lobby, agitated, searching her purse. Marcus approaching, asking what was wrong. Eleanor showing him something too small to see on the security camera. Marcus taking it carefully, promising something. Eleanor's face relaxing, her hand on his arm, trusting. That must have been when she gave him the photograph. James closed his laptop. His throat felt tight. He had been so certain at the funeral that Marcus was an opportunist, someone trying to take advantage, someone who didn't belong. He had ordered the man removed without asking a single question. He had cost Marcus his job without even considering that his mother's friendship might have been real. And then James had done nothing while his building manager fired the man and evicted him. The head of security had included one more document in the file. A screenshot from a community forum where someone had posted the photograph of Marcus being removed from the funeral. The comments beneath it were vicious. Crazy person crashes funeral. Probably trying to get money from the family. Hope they arrested him. Keep your kids away from people like this. The damage was done. Marcus Chen's face was now associated with disruption, with inappropriateness, with being the kind of person who couldn't read social cues, who didn't know his place. James had made sure of that by having him removed in front of witnesses with cameras. James picked up his phone and called Patricia Kent, the building manager at Hillcrest Towers. I need you to reverse Marcus Chen's termination, James said without preamble. Mr. Whitmore, I don't think that's advisable, given the incident and the security concerns. There were no security concerns. My mother was friends with him. Real friends. I made a mistake at the funeral. I want it corrected. Patricia's voice was carefully neutral. Mr. Chen has already been terminated and given notice to vacate his apartment. I've listed the unit for a new tenant. The paperwork is complete. Then undo it. With respect, sir, it's not that simple. Mr. Chen's behavior at the funeral has been documented online. Other residents have expressed discomfort. Even if we rehired him, the situation has become untenable. He would be working in an environment where people view him with suspicion. James closed his eyes. She was right. He couldn't just snap his fingers and reverse the damage. Marcus's reputation was shattered. His employment was terminated. His housing was gone. And it was all because James had assumed the worst about a man whose only crime was caring about Eleanor Whitmore. When does he have to be out of the apartment? James asked. December 31st, 2 weeks from today. And where will he go? That's not really the building's concern, Mr. Whitmore. James ended the call. He sat in his office, surrounded by the trappings of success, glass and steel and modern art, looking out over his city where somewhere in its depths Marcus Chen was trying to figure out how to keep his son fed and housed through the winter. There had to be a way to fix this. James had resources, connections, power. He could find Marcus a job. He could help with housing. He could write a check large enough to solve the immediate problems. But something held him back. Some instinct that said a check wasn't enough. That this situation required something more personal. Something that acknowledged the friendship his mother had valued. Something that treated Marcus Chen like a human being who deserved more than charity from a guilty billionaire. James picked up his phone again and dialed his personal assistant. Clear my schedule for tomorrow morning. I need to make a visit. While James was making plans in his tower office, Marcus was living through his own version of hell 3 miles south. It was day 5 of unemployment. Marcus had applied for 6 to 7 jobs and received 11 rejections, 56 silences. He had called 23 landlords and been turned down by all of them. His phone was still shut off. His bank account held $93. The apartment had to be vacated in 9 days. Tommy had stopped asking when they were moving. The boy had developed a new habit of hoarding food. Marcus would find crackers in Tommy's pockets, granola bars hidden under his pillow, an apple wrapped in a napkin in his backpack. His 6-year-old son was preparing for famine like a refugee because he had learned that food was not guaranteed, that home was not permanent, that the adults in charge could not always keep their promises. Marcus tried to hide the worst of it from Tommy. He acted like everything was fine, like he had plans, like the job applications and housing searches were just formalities before they landed somewhere better. But Tommy was smart. Tommy heard Marcus pacing at night. Tommy saw the rejection emails before Marcus could close the laptop. Tommy felt the fear that radiated from his father like heat from a radiator. On day 6, Marcus sold his laptop for $120 to a pawn shop that knew desperation when it walked through the door. He used $50 to turn his phone back on. The rest went to groceries and Tommy's school expenses. The laptop had been his only tool for job searching, but he could use library computers. He had to believe there was still a path forward. On day 7, Tommy came home from school with a letter from the administration. Due to unpaid after-school care fees totaling $240, Tommy could no longer attend the program. Effective immediately, the letter was apologetic but firm. They had a waiting list. They couldn't afford to provide free services. They hoped Marcus understood. Marcus understood perfectly. Without after-school care, he couldn't work any job that required him to be present before 6 p.m., which eliminated most of the positions he was qualified for. He would have to find work he could do while caring for Tommy, which meant gig economy jobs with no benefits, no stability, no path forward. On day 8, Marcus woke up with a fever. The headache that had been bothering him for days had become a migraine that made it hard to see, hard to think, hard to function. He couldn't afford to be sick. There was no backup plan, no one to call, no way to take a day off from the constant hustle of survival. He took the last of the over-the-counter medication and pushed through, walking Tommy to school, going to the library to apply for more jobs, picking up Tommy, making dinner, helping with homework, all while his body screamed that it needed rest it could not have. On day 9, the fever got worse. Marcus's vision blurred. His hands shook. Tommy watched him with scared eyes, asking if Daddy was okay, asking if he needed medicine, asking questions that Marcus couldn't answer because the truth was he probably needed a doctor but couldn't afford one, probably needed antibiotics but had no prescription, probably needed rest but had no time. That night, Marcus collapsed in the apartment bathroom while Tommy was sleeping. He came to on the floor, disoriented, his head throbbing, his body aching. He pulled himself up to the sink and looked at his reflection. The man staring back was gaunt, exhausted, defeated. The programmer with a computer science degree had been replaced by someone who looked like the worst stereotypes people have about poverty, about failure, about people who can't keep it together. Marcus splashed water on his face and went back to the mattress where Tommy was sleeping. He pulled his son close and allowed himself one moment of complete honesty. He was failing. Despite trying his hardest, despite doing everything right, despite being smart and educated and willing to work, he was failing to keep his child safe. The system that was supposed to catch people when they fell had massive holes, and Marcus and Tommy were slipping through. On day 10, Marcus received an email from the last job he had interviewed for before losing his phone. It was a position with a property management company, cleaning crew supervisor, $12 an hour, benefits after 90 days. The email was brief. Thank you for your interest. After reviewing your background check and online presence, we've decided to move forward with other candidates. Online presence. Marcus Googled himself and found the photograph from the funeral. It had spread. Multiple sites had picked it up. Some had turned it into a meme. Man crashes billionaire's mother's funeral with his face, his uniform, his grief turned into entertainment. The comments sections speculated about mental illness, homelessness, criminal behavior. One thread discussed whether he should be investigated for stalking Eleanor Whitmore. Another wondered if he had stolen the photograph he claimed she had given him. His online presence was now permanently associated with the worst moment of his life, and it was costing him jobs, housing, dignity. Marcus closed the browser. He sat in the library with his head in his hands, trying to remember how to breathe. When he picked up Tommy from school that day, the boy looked at him carefully and said, "Daddy, you don't look good. Your eyes are weird." Marcus's fever had spiked again. The library lights had been too bright, giving him a migraine that pulsed behind his eyes like a living thing. He made it back to the apartment on autopilot, got Tommy dinner, tucked him into bed, then collapsed himself. He woke up hours later to Tommy shaking his shoulder. "Daddy, you're really hot. And you're saying things that don't make sense." Marcus tried to focus. His son's face swam in and out of clarity. The room was spinning. His body felt like it was burning from the inside. "I'm okay," he tried to say, but his voice came out slurred. "You're not okay." Tommy's face was terrified. "You need help." "Can't afford help." Marcus closed his eyes. "Just need to sleep. Be better tomorrow." But he wasn't better tomorrow. On day 11, Marcus couldn't get out of bed. The fever had him in its grip, cycling between chills and sweats, hallucinations and clarity. Tommy stayed home from school, too scared to leave his father alone. The 6-year-old tried to help, bringing water, covering Marcus with blankets, asking questions Marcus couldn't answer. At some point, Tommy went to the building's front desk. Marcus was barely aware of it happening. He floated in and out of consciousness, remembering Lily in the hospital bed, remembering Eleanor in the lobby, remembering the funeral and the hands on his shoulders and the shame of being removed from a place he thought he belonged. When he woke up again, someone was knocking on the apartment door. Tommy went to answer it, and Marcus heard voices. One was familiar but unexpected, completely out of place in this context. "Is your father home?" James Whitmore's voice, controlled and concerned. "Tommy, right? I met you at the funeral. I'm Mrs. Whitmore's son." Marcus tried to sit up, tried to tell Tommy not to let him in, tried to salvage some dignity before the billionaire saw them like this, sick and poor and desperate in their basement apartment with a single barred window. But his body wouldn't cooperate. He heard footsteps. Then James Whitmore was standing in the doorway of the tiny apartment, looking at Marcus with an expression that might have been shock or pity or something more complicated. What happened next? What James discovered when he walked into that apartment? What truth was revealed about the photograph, about Eleanor's friendship with Marcus, about the damage that had been done and the debt that was owed? That's a story that deserves its own chapter. Because this is where everything changes. This is where the fall ends and something else begins. But before we get there, before we talk about rescue and redemption and whether any of it came in time, I need you to understand something. The story I'm telling you isn't rare. Thousands of people are living this exact scenario right now. Losing jobs for reasons that aren't their fault. Getting sick when they can't afford to be sick. Watching their children go hungry and scared. Falling through the cracks of systems that are supposed to catch them. And the truth is, most of them don't get a billionaire showing up at their door. Most of them just keep falling. So if this story is reaching you, if it's making you feel something, if you're starting to understand how quickly a life can unravel, I need you to do more than just watch. Like this video if you think these stories matter. Comment below with your thoughts, with your own experiences, with resources for people who are struggling. Subscribe to this channel because these stories need to be told, and they need to be heard. Share this video with someone who needs to understand what poverty actually looks like, what it feels like, how it happens to good people who did everything right. And check the description for resources because if this is your story, if you're living this right now, there are people who want to help, and you're not alone. James Whitmore stood in the doorway of Marcus Chen's apartment and saw the truth his mother had been trying to tell him for years. The truth about who was invisible and who was seen, about who mattered and who was forgotten, about the distance between his world and the world of the people who made his world possible. And in that moment, watching Marcus try to sit up, try to maintain dignity even while burning with fever, try to protect his terrified son even while collapsing, James Whitmore made a decision that would change all of their lives. But that decision, and everything that came after it, that's what happens next. And trust me, you want to be here for it. James Whitmore had imagined this meeting going differently. In his mind, he would find Marcus Chen somewhere respectable, would explain that he had reviewed the evidence and understood his mother's friendship with the janitor, would offer assistance that would be gratefully accepted, would feel better about the whole situation. Quick, clean, transactional. Instead, he was standing in a basement apartment that smelled like mildew and sickness, looking at a man who was clearly dangerously ill and a 6-year-old child who was trying to care for his father alone. How long has he been like this? James asked Tommy, keeping his voice gentle. 3 days. Tommy's small voice was steady, but his hands were shaking. He keeps saying he's fine, but he's not fine. He won't let me call anyone. He said we don't have money for doctors. James knelt down to Marcus's eye level. Marcus, can you hear me? Marcus's eyes opened. They were unfocused and glassy with fever. Get out. His voice was barely a whisper. Don't need your pity. I'm not here to pity you. I'm here because I was wrong about what happened at my mother's funeral. I reviewed the security footage from the building. I saw how she treated you, how you treated her. You weren't lying. You were her friend. Doesn't matter now. Marcus tried to push himself up and failed. Already lost the job. Already losing the apartment. Already destroyed. Your apology doesn't change anything. No, but my help might. When did you last see a doctor? Can't afford a doctor. James pulled out his phone and called his personal physician. Dr. Morrison, I need you to make a house call. Immediately. He gave the address, ignoring Marcus's weak protests. Yes, I understand it's outside normal procedures. I'll make it worth your time. While they waited for the doctor, James looked around the apartment properly. 1 room, 1 small bathroom, a hot plate instead of a stove, clothes folded in cardboard boxes. Tommy's homework spread on the floor because there was no table. A single photograph on a cardboard box nightstand. A woman who must have been Lily, Marcus's deceased wife, smiling in what looked like happier times. And next to it, the photograph of Eleanor as a child. The one Marcus had tried to show him at the funeral. The torn corner, the faded colors, the proof that his mother had trusted this man with her most precious memory. James picked it up carefully. She gave you this. Yes. Marcus's voice was gaining some strength, fueled by defiance. 2 years ago, when she was scared of forgetting, she asked me to keep it safe, because she trusted me, because we were friends. But you didn't believe that at the funeral. You had me thrown out like I was garbage. I know. I was wrong. Being wrong doesn't fix anything. Look around. Look at what your wrong cost me. I lost my job. I'm losing my home. I can't feed my son properly. I can't afford medicine. I can't afford to be sick. And it's all because I went to your mother's funeral to say goodbye to someone who actually treated me like a human being. James had no defense. Everything Marcus said was true. His mistake, his assumption, his order to have security remove the janitor, had cascaded into this. The job loss, the eviction, the online harassment, the applications rejected because employers Googled Marcus's name and found the photograph from the funeral. Dr. Morrison arrived within 30 minutes, a gray-haired man with a professional manner and expensive medical bag. He examined Marcus efficiently while James took Tommy into the bathroom, giving them privacy, trying to explain to the frightened child that help had arrived. Is my dad going to die? Tommy asked bluntly, like my mom did. The question hit James like a punch. No, he's going to be fine. The doctor is very good. He's going to give your dad medicine and make sure he gets better. And then what? We still have to leave here. We still don't have anywhere to go. Dad applied for 1 million jobs, and nobody wants him because of what happened at the funeral. Tommy looked at James with eyes that were far too old for 6. You made everything worse. You didn't even ask if he was telling the truth. You just decided he was bad, and you threw him out. Another truth James couldn't deny. I know. I'm trying to make it right now. My mom used to say that saying sorry isn't enough. You have to actually fix what you broke. Can you fix this? James looked down at this small boy who had lost his mother, was losing his home, was watching his father collapse under the weight of circumstances that were fundamentally unjust. Yes, he said. I can fix this. Promise. James hesitated. He had learned not to make promises he couldn't keep. But looking at Tommy's desperate hope, at the child's need to believe that adults could actually solve problems instead of creating them, James heard himself say, I promise. Dr. Morrison emerged from the main room 15 minutes later. Severe pneumonia. Probably walking around with it for over a week. His immune system is compromised, likely from stress and malnutrition. He needs hospitalization, 4 antibiotics, rest. If he had waited another day or two without treatment, we'd be looking at a much worse outcome. Arrange for an ambulance, James said. Take him to Presbyterian. I'll cover all costs. And the child? James looked at Tommy. The boy was staring at the wall, processing the information that his father was sick enough to need a hospital. The same hospital where his mother had died. The same antiseptic smell. The same beeping machines. The same fear. He'll come with me, James said. I'll make sure he's taken care of while his father recovers. The ambulance arrived. Paramedics loaded Marcus onto a stretcher. He was too weak to protest much, too sick to argue about the cost, too exhausted to maintain the pride that had been keeping him upright. Tommy tried to climb into the ambulance, but James held him back gently. They need to help your dad right now. We'll follow in my car and meet them at the hospital. Okay. Tommy nodded, tears finally spilling over. James led him to the black town car waiting outside Hillcrest Towers, the same kind of car that had been at Eleanor's funeral, the same kind of car that represented wealth and distance and the gap between worlds. Tommy climbed in, small and scared and holding a backpack with everything he owned. At the hospital, James used his name and his connections to cut through bureaucracy. Marcus was admitted immediately, taken to a private room, started on strong antibiotics. The attending physician explained that it would be several days before they knew if the pneumonia would respond to treatment, longer before Marcus would be well enough to be discharged. Tommy sat in the waiting room, silent and pale. James bought him dinner from the cafeteria, watched him pick at it, saw the 1,000-yard stare of a child who had been traumatized too many times. Where am I supposed to sleep? Tommy finally asked. They are not going to let me stay in Dad's room. And we don't have an apartment anymore. The lease ended today. James had forgotten that detail. December 31st, the eviction date. While Marcus was being admitted to the hospital, the belongings were being removed from the building. Everything they owned, which admittedly wasn't much, was probably already in storage or on the curb. You'll stay with me, James said before he could overthink it. In my apartment, until your dad is better and we figure out something permanent. You live in the building, in the penthouse. Tommy's voice was flat. The place Dad wasn't even allowed to clean. Yes. Why are you doing this? Why do you care now when you didn't care at the funeral? It was another question James didn't have a good answer for. Guilt, maybe. Recognition that he had caused this situation. Awareness that his mother would be furious if she knew how he had treated her friend. All of those things, but also something more fundamental. Looking at Marcus in that apartment, sick and poor and trying to maintain dignity, James had seen himself in some alternate universe where different circumstances had led to a different life. Where a wife's illness could bankrupt a family, where a job loss could trigger a spiral, where the safety net everyone assumed existed had massive holes that people fell through every day. My mother saw something in your father, James finally said. Something worth respecting. I didn't see it at first, but I see it now. He's trying his best in impossible circumstances. That matters. Is that enough? Trying your best. It should be. They sat in silence for a while. Then Tommy said, Your mom was nice to me. When Dad had to bring me to work sometimes, she would read me stories. She didn't act like I was bothering her or like I shouldn't be there. She made me feel like I was supposed to exist. The phrasing broke James's heart. Made me feel like I was supposed to exist. What kind of world made 6-year-olds question whether they had a right to exist? At midnight, when the hospital staff said Marcus was stable but still unconscious from exhaustion and medication, James took Tommy to his penthouse apartment. The boy was quiet in the elevator, watching the numbers climb, holding his backpack like a shield. When the doors opened directly into James's foyer, marble floors and modern art and floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city, Tommy stopped moving. It's too nice, he whispered. I'm going to break something. You're not going to break anything. Come on, I'll show you the guest room. The guest room was larger than the entire apartment Tommy and Marcus had shared. It had a real bed with a thick mattress, clean sheets that smelled like lavender, its own bathroom with a tub and shower. Tommy stood in the doorway like he was afraid to enter. "Is this real?" he asked. "Are you really letting me stay here?" "Yes. And Dad is really going to get better." "Yes. The doctors are very good. The medicine will work. He's going to be okay." Tommy finally walked into the room and sat carefully on the edge of the bed. He looked so small in the expensive space, a child from one world transported into another, trying to figure out if he belonged or if this was just temporary shelter before being thrown back out. "I have school tomorrow," Tommy said. "I need to go to school. Dad says missing school is what starts kids falling behind, and once you're behind, you never catch up." James called the school and arranged for Tommy to be picked up and dropped off by car service. He ordered clothes in Tommy's size to be delivered first thing in the morning. He made a mental note to enroll the boy in the building's temporary childcare program that he dimly remembered existed for residents, but had never paid attention to before. Tommy fell asleep still wearing his clothes, too exhausted to change, too overwhelmed to process any of it. James covered him with a blanket and left the door cracked open, then went to his home office and started making phone calls. First, to his lawyer. "I need you to help someone with medical debt. Marcus Chen. I want all his outstanding medical bills paid in full. I want the collections stopped. I want his credit repaired. How long will that take?" The lawyer was used to unusual requests at odd hours. For that amount of debt and damage, several months at minimum. There are processes, negotiations, documentation. And some things, like credit scores, rebuild over time. You can't just write a check and make it go away. "Fine. Start the process. Bill me for everything." Next, he called Patricia Kent, the building manager. It was 1 in the morning, but he didn't care. Marcus Chen's apartment. What happened to his belongings? They were boxed up and placed in storage as per standard procedure when a tenant vacates. Patricia's voice was cool. "Is there a problem, Mr. Whitmore?" "I want his possessions moved to a new apartment. Something in the building, something appropriate for a family. 2 bedrooms, decent light, not a basement." "Mr. Whitmore, I already explained that rehiring Mr. Chen is not advisable. The other residents. I don't care what the other residents think. My mother valued him. That means something. Find him an apartment. He can't afford. I'll cover the rent. Just find the apartment." There was a long pause. Then, "I'll see what's available." James hung up and sat in his office, looking out at the city, thinking about the enormous gap between his world and Marcus's world and how arbitrary the distance was. 6 months of bad luck, a wife's illness, a job loss. That's all it took to go from stable to desperate. And once you were desperate, the systems that were supposed to help instead pushed you further down. Bad credit meant higher interest rates. No permanent address meant no job offers. Being poor was expensive in ways that people with money never had to understand. His mother had understood. Eleanor had seen Marcus not as a janitor but as a person with skills and dreams who had been crushed by circumstances. She had tried, in her small way, to help. Books, conversations, kindness that cost her nothing but meant everything. And when she died, she had trusted Marcus with her most precious memory because she knew he would keep it safe. James had destroyed that trust by assuming Marcus was a threat instead of a friend. He had used his power thoughtlessly, had damaged a life without considering the consequences, had proven that the distance between rich and poor wasn't just about money but about who got to have their truth believed. But he could fix this. He had resources. He had connections. He could rebuild what he had torn down. Except fixing it turned out to be more complicated than writing checks. The next day, while Tommy was at school and Marcus was still in the hospital, James received a call from Patricia Kent. "We have a problem. I've been contacted by several board members expressing concerns about Marcus Chen returning to the building in any capacity. The photographs from the funeral have circulated among residents. There are questions about his stability, his intentions, whether he poses a risk." "A risk?" Jamesy's voice was ice. "Is a single father with pneumonia who was friends with my mother. What exactly is the risk?" "Perception, Mr. Whitmore. Fair or not, the incident at the funeral has created an image problem. Even if we secure him an apartment, even if his rent is covered, he'll be living in a building where people view him with suspicion. Is that really better than finding him housing elsewhere? James wanted to argue, wanted to insist that his word should be enough, that his ownership stake in the building meant he could override concerns about perception. But Patricia had a point. Forcing Marcus back into an environment where he would be treated like a threat wouldn't help anyone. Then the second problem emerged. Marcus's former employer had released a statement. In response to inquiries about Marcus Chen, the individual involved in the recent funeral incident, DataStream Solutions wished to clarify that Mr. Chen's employment had been terminated due to poor performance and attendance issues predating his wife's illness. The company had attempted to provide support and flexibility, but ultimately Mr. Chen's inability to meet basic job requirements had necessitated his dismissal. It was a lie. James had the termination documents from his security team's investigation. Marcus had been laid off along with 15 other employees when the company downsized. His performance reviews had been excellent. But DataStream was protecting itself, rewriting history to avoid looking heartless, creating a narrative where Marcus was fired for cause rather than circumstance. And that narrative was spreading. The same online forums that had mocked Marcus for crashing the funeral were now discussing his employment history, his dead wife's medical bills, whether he had been neglectful, whether the child should be in his custody. People who knew nothing about his life were picking apart his choices, his character, his worth as a human being, based on fragments of information twisted to fit the story they wanted to believe. James tried to fight it. He released his own statement through a publicist. Marcus Chen was a valued friend of my late mother, Eleanor Whitmore. The incident at her funeral was a misunderstanding that I deeply regret. Mr. Chen is a person of integrity who has faced extraordinary hardship with dignity and strength. Any reports to the contrary are false and malicious. The statement was picked up by some outlets and ignored by others. The online harassment continued. Someone started a thread speculating that Marcus had manipulated Eleanor in her declining mental state, that the photograph he claimed she gave him was actually stolen, that his presence in the building had been inappropriate all along. By day 3 of Marcus's hospitalization, James realized that his intervention was making things worse. His attempts to defend Marcus were drawing more attention, more speculation, more vicious commentary. The billionaire's guilt was being interpreted as evidence of Marcus's manipulation. The help James was trying to provide was being framed as proof that something untoward had happened between Marcus and Eleanor. James sat in his office, surrounded by lawyers and publicists and advisors, all of them telling him to back off, to let it die down, to help Marcus quietly if he must, but to stop making public statements that were feeding the narrative. He didn't do anything wrong, James said for the 10th time. He went to a funeral to mourn someone he cared about. That's all. Everything that happened after that is because I made assumptions and acted on them without asking questions. That may be true, his head of security said carefully. But the court of public opinion doesn't care about truth. They care about narrative. And right now, the narrative is that a poor man took advantage of a rich elderly woman, and you're either too guilty to admit it or too naive to see it. Then we change the narrative. How? By forcing the story harder. That hasn't worked. By doubling down on your defense of him. That's made it worse. Sometimes the best thing you can do is step back and let time pass. Help him behind the scenes. Pay his bills. Find him housing somewhere else. Set him up for success away from all this attention. James knew it was practical advice. Smart advice. The kind of advice that came from people who understood how the world actually worked rather than how it should work. But it felt like abandonment. Like hiding Marcus away because his poverty and his pain were embarrassing, because defending him was inconvenient, because the truth was less important than managing perception. On day 4, Marcus woke up. James was there when it happened, sitting beside the hospital bed during visiting hours, Tommy coloring in a chair nearby. Marcus's eyes opened slowly, focused, landed on James. "You're still here," Marcus said. His voice was rough but stronger. "I promised Tommy I would help. I keep my promises." "Where is here, exactly?" Marcus looked around the private hospital room, the expensive equipment, the window view. "How much is this costing?" "Don't worry about the cost. Easy for you to say. You have money. I have debt. Everything costs. Not this. This is covered. All of it. Your medical bills, your debt, your housing. I'm taking care of it. Marcus tried to sit up. Failed. Why? Because my mother cared about you. Because I was wrong to have you removed from her funeral. Because you shouldn't lose everything just for trying to say goodbye to a friend. And what do you get out of this? What's the price of your guilt? The question was sharp and fey. James didn't have a good answer. Maybe there's no price. Maybe I just want to do the right thing. The right thing would have been believing me at the funeral. The right thing would have been asking questions before calling security. The right thing would have been not destroying my life and then showing up to rebuild it like I should be grateful. Tommy looked up from his coloring. Dad, he's trying to help. I know, buddy, but help from people with power always comes with strings. Always comes with conditions. Always comes with the understanding that they're doing you a favor that you'll owe them for forever. Marcus wasn't wrong. The power imbalance was real. No matter how pure James's intentions, no matter how genuine his regret, the fact remained that he had the resources to save Marcus, and Marcus had no choice but to accept that salvation or drown. What do you want me to do? James asked. Walk away. Stop helping. Let you figure it out on your own. I want you to acknowledge that this is your fault. I want you to admit that you made assumptions about me based on my job and my clothes and my class. I want you to recognize that when you have power, your mistakes destroy people, and saying sorry doesn't unmake the damage. I acknowledge all of that, and I can't unmake what happened, but I can help make what comes next better. Better how? By paying my bills, by getting me an apartment, by giving me a job at one of your companies where everyone knows I'm the charity case. Better isn't the same as equal. Better isn't the same as just. The conversation was interrupted by a doctor making rounds, checking Marcus's vitals, discussing his recovery timeline. Another week in the hospital, then several weeks of rest before returning to normal activities. No strenuous work. Follow-up appointments. Physical therapy. After the doctor left, Marcus looked at Tommy. Come here, buddy. Tommy climbed carefully onto the hospital bed, tucking himself against his father's side. I was scared, the boy whispered. I thought you were going to die like Mom. I'm not going to die. I'm going to be fine. We're going to be fine. But we don't have a home anymore. And you don't have a job. And Mr. Whitmore says he's going to help, but you don't trust him. Marcus stroked his son's hair. I trust that he means well. I just don't know if meaning well is enough. James wanted to argue. Wanted to insist that his help was genuine, that his regret was real, that he wasn't trying to salve his conscience or manage his reputation. But sitting there, watching Marcus hold his son, seeing the protective way the father curled around the child even while weak and recovering, James understood something fundamental. This wasn't about him. His feelings, his guilt, his need for redemption, none of that mattered. What mattered was whether Marcus and Tommy ended up stable and safe and able to rebuild their lives without more trauma. That night, back in his penthouse, James made a decision. He called his lawyer again. I want to set up a trust for Marcus Chen and his son. Enough to cover housing, medical expenses, education for the child, living costs for the next 10 years. Managed independently, no strings attached, structured so they have access to funds but aren't overwhelmed. Can you do that? Of course. How much are we talking about? James did the math. Rent in a decent area, health insurance, food, clothes, child key, Tommy's education through high school and college, emergency fund, enough buffer that they never had to choose between medication and groceries again. 5 million. Structure it so Marcus has control, but also has professional guidance on managing it responsibly. I don't want him to feel like it's my money. I want him to feel like it's his security. The lawyer was quiet for a moment. That's very generous. It's barely adequate. My mistake cost him his job, his home, his health, his reputation. 5 million doesn't unmake that damage. It just tries to prevent future damage. But the next morning, when James went to the hospital to explain the trust, to show Marcus the paperwork, to demonstrate that this help came with no strings beyond proper financial management, he found the room empty. A nurse explained that Marcus had checked himself out against medical advice at 5 a.m. He had taken Tommy and left, refusing to provide a forwarding address, saying only that he needed to figure things out on his own terms. James stood in the empty hospital room, feeling something between frustration and respect. Marcus had rejected his help, had chosen uncertainty over obligation, had decided that owing nothing to the billionaire was worth more than financial security. It should have been the end of the story. The guilty rich man tries to help. The proud poor man refuses, both of them walking away to separate worlds that would never intersect again. But James Whitmore's mother had taught him something about persistence, about seeing people as they actually were rather than as society labeled them, about recognizing that sometimes the people who needed help most were the ones who had been betrayed too many times to accept it easily. He wasn't giving up. Not yet. Not while he still had resources, connections, and a promise to keep. Because that conversation Marcus had about strings and conditions and power, he was right. But he was also wrong about James's motivations. This wasn't about guilt or reputation or managing a scandal. This was about honoring Eleanor Whitmore's memory by doing what she had tried to do. See Marcus Chan as a person who deserved better than the hand he had been dealt. And maybe, just maybe, it was also about James learning what his mother had known all along. That the distance between the penthouse and the basement wasn't just physical. It was moral. It was about whether you used your power to help people up or keep them down. It was about whether you saw janitors as human beings or as fixtures in your building. Eleanor had seen Marcus as human, and now James had to prove he could do the same. Even if Marcus made it difficult, even if the help was rejected, even if doing the right thing was more complicated than writing a check. But first, he had to find Marcus and Tommy. And in a city of 8 million people, where a man with nothing had every reason to disappear, that was going to be harder than James had anticipated. Where did they go? How did they survive? And what would it take for Marcus to finally accept that not all help came with strings, that not all wealthy people saw the poor as disposable, that sometimes, just sometimes, a person could make a mistake and still deserve a chance to make it right? Those questions, and the answers that would finally bring truth to light, justice to bear, and redemption to everyone involved. That's what comes next. And if you've made it this far, if this story has grabbed you and won't let go, then you already know what I need you to do. Like this video if you believe in second chances, if you think people deserve better than judgment based on circumstances, if you believe wealth should come with responsibility. Comment below and tell me if you think Marcus was right to refuse James's help, or if he should have taken it for Tommy's sake. Subscribe to this channel because this story is reaching its peak and you need to see how it ends. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that poverty isn't a moral failing and that the systems we trust to catch people often let them fall. And check the description for real resources, real organizations, real ways to help people like Marcus and Tommy. Because fiction should inspire action, and stories should make us better. James Whitmore was about to learn that finding a poor man in a rich city was almost impossible when that man wanted to stay hidden. But almost impossible isn't the same as impossible. And when you have resources, determination, and the memory of a mother who believed in seeing people clearly, sometimes you find a way. Marcus and Tommy had been gone for 3 days when James finally found them. It took private investigators, a network of community organizations, and finally a tip from a homeless shelter director who remembered a man with a sick son asking about temporary housing. They were staying at a family shelter in Brooklyn, a clean but crowded facility where Marcus had taken a bed in the men's wing and Tommy was sleeping in the children's area, separated from his father every night, both of them existing in the in-between space of people whose lives had been upended but not yet rebuilt. James showed up at the shelter on a cold January morning without calling ahead, knowing that if he warned Marcus he was coming, the man would run again. He found him in the common area, Tommy doing homework at a table nearby, both of them looking better than they had in the hospital, but still carrying the weight of exhaustion that came from living without security. Marcus saw James and his whole body tensed. "How did you find us?" "I'm very good at finding people who don't want to be found. Can we talk?" "I don't have anything to say to you. I made my decision. I don't want your help." "It's not about help. It's about truth. Please, 5 minutes." Marcus looked at Tommy, who was watching the conversation with worried eyes. "Fine. 5 minutes. Outside." They stood on the sidewalk in front of the shelter, breath fogging in the cold air. James pulled out a folder and handed it to Marcus. "This is the security footage from Hillcrest Towers. Every interaction you had with my mother for the past 4 years. I watched all of it. Every conversation, every kindness, every moment where she treated you like a friend instead of an employee. Marcus didn't open the folder. What's your point? My point is that I was wrong. Completely wrong. My mother valued you. She saw you as a person who mattered. And I dishonored her memory by treating you like a threat. But I also learned something else from watching that footage. She wasn't just being kind to you. She was lonely. She was isolated in that expensive building, surrounded by wealthy people who didn't see her as a person either. They saw her as my mother, as a connection to money and power. You were the only person who talked to her like she was just Eleanor. She was just Eleanor. That's who I knew. Not a philanthropist or board member or billionaire's mother. Just a woman who liked books and worried about forgetting things and made paper airplanes with my son. Marcus's voice cracked. And when she died, I wanted to say goodbye to that person. But you made it clear that I didn't have the right. That knowing Eleanor meant nothing because I was poor and wearing a uniform. I know, and I'm sorry. But sorry isn't enough, so I did something else. James pulled out another folder. I hired an investigation firm to look into what happened after the funeral. How you lost your job, how the online harassment started, how your employment history got rewritten. And I found out who was behind it. Marcus finally opened the folder. Inside were documents, screenshots, email chains. Patricia Kent, the building manager, had been the one feeding information to online forums. She had contacted Marcus's former employer and suggested they issue a statement protecting themselves from liability. She had spoken to board members at Hillcrest Towers about Marcus being a security risk. She had systematically destroyed his reputation because she viewed him as a problem that needed to be eliminated. Why? Marcus looked up from the pages. I never did anything to her. I kept my head down, did my job, stayed invisible. Because you weren't invisible to my mother. Because Eleanor advocated for you a few times, asking that you be promoted to day shift so you could spend more time with your son, suggesting that you be given first priority if any administrative positions opened up in the building. Patricia saw that as inappropriate, as an elderly woman being manipulated by hired help. She couldn't fire you while my mother was alive because Eleanor would have complained. But after the funeral, when I had you removed, she saw her opportunity. Marcus sat down on the curb, folder in his hands, processing the information. So it wasn't just your mistake. It was a coordinated effort to make sure I stayed down. Yes, and I'm not bringing you this information to make you feel better. I'm bringing it to you because there's going to be a board meeting at Hillcrest Towers tomorrow. Patricia Kent is being removed from her position. The board members who participated in the harassment are being held accountable. Your former employer is being required to issue a correction and a public apology. And I'm going to that meeting to tell everyone what really happened, who my mother really was, and who you really are. I don't want to be the subject of some public redemption story. I don't want people's pity or their belated recognition that maybe they judged me wrong. It's not about redemption. It's about truth. My mother treated you with respect because you deserved it. She saw something in you that other people missed because they were too busy looking at your uniform instead of your face. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows that. Not so you'll feel better. Not so I'll feel better. But so Tommy knows that his father's dignity matters. That the truth matters. That people who use their power to crush others should be held accountable. Tommy had come outside, drawn by the serious tone of the conversation. Dad, what's happening? Marcus pulled his son close. Mr. Whitmore is trying to fix things. But I'm not sure things can be fixed. They can, James said. Not perfectly. Not so that everything is the same as before. But enough that you can move forward without this weight on you. Enough that when someone Googles your name, they find the truth instead of lies. The next day, James Whitmore stood before the board of Hillcrest Towers and told them everything. About Eleanor's friendship with Marcus. About the footage showing years of kindness and respect. About Patricia Kent's coordinated campaign to destroy a man's reputation because she viewed him as beneath his station. About the shame James felt for participating in that destruction by having Marcus removed from the funeral without asking a single question. The board members sat in uncomfortable silence. Some of them had participated in the gossip. Some had forwarded the photographs. Some had assumed, like James had, that Marcus was an opportunist rather than a genuine friend. James showed them the footage. 4 years of small kindnesses. Eleanor dropping her keys. Marcus returning them. Eleanor crying in the lobby at midnight. Marcus sitting with her, saying nothing, just being present. Eleanor teaching Tommy to make paper airplanes. Marcus thanking her with tears in his eyes. When the footage ended, James placed the photograph on the table. The original photograph of young Eleanor, with its torn corner and faded colors. This belonged to my mother. It was her most precious possession. She gave it to Marcus Chen to keep safe because she trusted him. Because he had proven, through years of small interactions, that he was someone who valued things that mattered. She didn't give it to me. She didn't give it to any of you. She gave it to a janitor because he saw her as a person instead of as a source of prestige or money or access. He paused, letting that truth sink in. Marcus Chen did nothing wrong. He attended a funeral for someone he cared about. He tried to share information about a photograph because he thought it mattered. And in return, he was humiliated, fired, evicted, and slandered online. This building, this organization, these systems, they all failed him. We failed him. And I'm here to say that we're going to make it right. James outlined his demands. Patricia Kent terminated immediately. Formal apologies from the board. Financial compensation for Marcus's lost wages and housing costs. Correction of the false employment record from DataStream Solutions. Removal of all defamatory content that was within their power to remove. And one more thing. Hillcrest Towers is going to establish a fund in Eleanor Whitmore's name. A fund to help employees facing hardship due to medical debt, family emergencies, or circumstances beyond their control. We're going to create a system where people like Marcus don't fall through the cracks because they don't have the resources or connections to fight back. We're going to make sure that the next person who faces tragedy doesn't also face bankruptcy and homelessness. The board voted, not unanimously, but overwhelmingly. Patricia Kent was terminated. The apologies were drafted. The fund was established with James's personal contribution of $5 million to be managed by a committee that included building employees and community advocates. But James wasn't done. He held a press conference that afternoon. Not in the building. Not in some corporate setting. At the family shelter where Marcus and Tommy were staying. With Marcus standing beside him, Tommy holding his father's hand, both of them looking uncertain about this sudden public exposure, but willing to trust that this time, the truth would be told correctly. James spoke to the cameras about his mother, about her values, about the friendship she had treasured with someone the world viewed as insignificant. He spoke about his own failure, his assumptions, his complicity in a system that judged people by their income rather than their character. He spoke about the need for structural change, for systems that supported people during hardship instead of punishing them for circumstances beyond their control. And then he handed the microphone to Marcus. Marcus stood there for a moment, looking at the cameras, at the reporters, at the audience that had watched his humiliation go viral and was now being asked to witness his vindication. "My name is Marcus Chen," he said quietly. "I'm a father. I'm a widower. I'm a programmer. I'm a janitor. I'm a lot of things. But mostly, I'm just a person who tried to say goodbye to a friend and got destroyed for it. Eleanor Whitmore treated me with kindness when most people treated me like I was invisible. She saw me. She saw my son. She made us feel like we mattered. And when she died, all I wanted was to honor that. To say thank you. To be present for the grief I felt." His voice grew stronger. "But I learned something from what happened. I learned that kindness isn't enough if the systems we live in are designed to punish people for being poor. I learned that individual generosity doesn't matter if the structures we've built ensure that some people fall and keep falling. I learned that saying I'm sorry is meaningless if it doesn't come with real change." He looked at James. Mr. Whitmore made a mistake. He owned it. He's trying to fix it. That matters. But what matters more is whether this moment changes anything beyond my individual situation. Whether the next person who loses a job and can't pay medical bills gets help instead of harassment. Whether the next janitor who befriends a resident is treated with respect instead of suspicion. Whether we build a world where your worth isn't measured by your bank account and where falling on hard times doesn't mean you lose your dignity along with everything else. The press conference ended. The footage went viral, but this time for different reasons. This time, people saw Marcus as a human being. They saw Tommy as a child who deserved stability. They saw the system that had failed them and the rare moment when someone with power chose to make it right. Hillcrest Towers received applications to the Eleanor Whitmore Assistance Fund within hours. Stories of employees struggling with rent because of medical emergencies, facing eviction because of family crises, choosing between food and medication because their wages didn't stretch far enough. The $5 million James had contributed would help dozens of families. But it would need to be more. It would need to be a permanent structure, a foundation, a commitment that outlasted the news cycle. James made it permanent. He hired Marcus as the fund's first director. Not as charity, not as an apology, but because Marcus understood, from lived experience, what it meant to need help. Because he knew how to evaluate genuine need versus opportunism. Because he had the empathy and the understanding that came from having been there himself, from having chosen between his son's medication and their electricity, from having known what it felt like to be invisible until someone chose to see you. The salary was fair. The benefits were comprehensive. The work was meaningful. Marcus accepted, not because he needed James Whitmore's approval, but because the job itself aligned with what he cared about. Helping people who were where he had been. Building systems that worked instead of systems that crushed. Making sure that Eleanor Whitmore's legacy was about more than money and philanthropy. That it was about the quiet kindness she had shown to someone the world had dismissed. 6 months later, Marcus and Tommy moved into a 3-bedroom apartment in a building with good schools, safe streets, a park nearby. Not in Hillcrest Towers. Too many memories there. Too much history. But close enough that Tommy could visit the lobby where Eleanor had read him stories, where his father had worked, where their lives had intersected with Hayes in ways that had seemed insignificant at the time, but had turned out to matter enormously. They unpacked slowly. Real furniture this time, not cardboard boxes. Tommy's room had a real bed, a desk for homework, shelves for books. Marcus's room had space to breathe, windows that let in light, a sense of permanence that had been missing for years. The photograph of Eleanor, the original with its torn corner and faded colors, hung on the wall in the living room. Tommy asked about it sometimes, wanting to hear stories about the woman who had been kind to them, who had seen them when others looked away, whose death had been the catalyst for both their worst nightmare and their eventual recovery. She was special, Marcus would say, not because she was rich or important, but because she treated people like they mattered. All people, not just the ones who could do something for her. Tommy was thriving. The nightmares had stopped. The food hoarding had gradually disappeared. He talked about his mother now without the immediate crushing grief, able to remember her with love instead of just pain. He drew pictures of their new apartment with actual gardens outside, dreams rendered real. Marcus himself was different too. Still careful with money. Still aware of how quickly security could disappear. But no longer carrying the weight of shame that had pressed on him since the funeral. No longer wondering if Eleanor's kindness had been real or imagined. No longer believing that being poor meant being disposable. He ran the Eleanor Whitmore Assistance Fund with dedication and precision. In 6 months, they had helped 23 families avoid eviction, covered medical expenses for 14 employees facing bankruptcy, provided childcare subsidies for 9 single parents trying to work while raising kids alone. The fund had established partnerships with hospitals for medical debt negotiation, with landlords for emergency housing, with schools for educational support. It was working. Not perfectly, not for everyone, but for the people it did help. It was the difference between surviving and drowning. James Whitmore attended the fund's 6-month review meeting. He and Marcus had developed something like friendship, though both men acknowledged the inherent complication in a relationship that had started with such a massive power imbalance. They were cordial. They were respectful. They worked well together, but they weren't close in the way James and Eleanor had been close, in the way Marcus and Eleanor had been close. Maybe that was okay. Maybe some relationships existed specifically to create change rather than to provide companionship. Maybe the point wasn't for James and Marcus to become friends. Maybe the point was for the system to become more just. After the meeting, James asked Marcus to walk with him. They ended up at the park near Marcus's new apartment, watching Tommy play on the swings with other children, his laughter carrying on the wind. "I never thank you properly," James said, "for giving me a chance to make this right. You could have refused all of it, could have stayed angry, could have rejected every attempt I made to fix what I broke." "I almost did," Marcus admitted. "But Tommy deserved better than my pride. And your mother deserved better than both of us carrying anger she wouldn't have wanted. Do you think she would be proud of the fund, of what we've built?" Marcus considered the question carefully. "I think she would be glad. I think she would say that it was a start, that there's more work to do, that kindness is good but justice is better." Fair assessment. They watched Tommy swing higher, his joy uncomplicated by the knowledge of how close they had come to losing everything. 6 years old, just starting to understand that life could be stable, that home could be permanent, that fear didn't have to be the baseline emotion. "I'm going to keep doing this work," Marcus said. "Beyond the fund. I want to advocate for policy changes, for medical debt reform, for tenant protections, for all the systemic things that broke when I needed them to hold. Your mother's kindness saved me in small ways, but we need systems that save people in big ways. I'll support that. Whatever you need. Connections, funding, platform. You've earned the credibility to speak on this. Use it." Marcus nodded. "I will. Not because I owe you, but because the next person who faces what I face shouldn't need a billionaire to feel guilty in order to survive. They should survive because the systems work. Because we've built a society that values all people, not just the ones who have enough money to matter." That evening, Marcus and Tommy had dinner in their new apartment. Real groceries from the store, not food pantry donations. Tommy's favorite meal, cooked with care, eaten at a table instead of on the floor. Small markers of security that meant everything. "Dad!" Tommy looked up from his plate. "Are we going to be okay now? Like, really okay?" Marcus met his son's eyes. "Yeah, buddy, we're going to be okay. We have a home. We have enough money. We have help if we need it. We're safe. Because Mr. Whitmore helped us. Because a lot of things happened. Because Mrs. Whitmore was kind to us. Because Mr. Whitmore realized he made a mistake and tried to fix it. Because sometimes people do the right thing even when it's hard. Because we didn't give up. I'm glad we didn't give up." "Me too." After Tommy was in bed, Marcus sat in his living room looking at Eleanor's photograph. 7 years old, grinning at the camera, holding a book, standing in front of a garden that would burn. She hadn't known what was coming. The loss, the long life afterward, the son who would become successful, the loneliness in an expensive building, the friendship with a janitor that would outlast her death. Marcus thought about the chain of events that had led him here. Lily's illness, the bankruptcy, the job losses, the descent into poverty, meeting Eleanor, her death, the funeral disaster, Jamesy's guilt and redemption arc, the fund, this apartment, this moment of breathing without panic. It could have ended differently. Usually did. 4 people in his situation. Usually there was no billionaire showing up to fix things. No viral redemption. No fund or job or stable housing. Just continued falling until you hit a bottom that was darker and more permanent. Marcus had been lucky. He knew that. Lucky that Eleanor had befriended him. Lucky that James had felt guilty enough to investigate instead of just moving on. Lucky that the chain of events had led to help instead of just more harm. But luck shouldn't be required for survival. And that's what the next chapter of Marcus's life would be about. Making sure luck wasn't the difference between making it and not making it. Building systems where everyone got the support that Marcus had needed, whether or not they happened to befriend a wealthy woman, whether or not that woman's son felt obligated to make things right. The work ahead was enormous. Policy change, public advocacy, shifting cultural narratives about who deserved help and who deserved judgment. But Marcus had learned something from his own experience. He had learned that stories mattered. That when people saw the full truth of someone's life, when they understood the circumstances and the choices and the systems that had failed, their perceptions changed. His story had changed perceptions. Not for everyone. Some people still believed he had been an opportunist. Some people still thought the funeral incident proved something negative about his character. But enough people had heard the truth and recognized it as truth that the tide had shifted. If one story could do that, what could many stories do? What could happen if people heard from dozens, hundreds, thousands of individuals who had fallen through the cracks not because they were lazy or irresponsible, but because the systems we built to catch them had massive holes? Maybe that was the real legacy of Eleanor Whitmore's kindness. Not just the fund that bore her name, not just the family that had been saved, but the recognition that every person had a story, a dignity, a worth that existed independent of their economic status. That seeing people clearly, the way Eleanor had seen Marcus, was an act of radical respect in a world that encouraged blindness. Marcus stood up and walked to Tommy's room. His son was sleeping peacefully, no nightmares, no fear, just the deep rest of a child who felt safe. Marcus adjusted the blanket, kissed his son's forehead, stood there for a moment feeling gratitude so intense it was almost painful. They had made it, against odds that should have crushed them, through circumstances that destroyed most people who faced them. Past shame and judgment and systemic failure. They had made it to the other side, and now Marcus's job was to build a bridge so the next person didn't have to swim. Here is what I need you to understand about this story. It ended well. Marcus and Tommy got help. James made amends. Systems changed. But this is fiction, and in reality, most stories don't end this way. Most people in Marcus's situation don't get rescued. Most billionaires don't investigate and feel guilty. Most systems don't change because one person's suffering became visible. So if this story moved you, if you saw yourself or someone you know in Marcus's struggle, if you believe that people deserve better than a society that punishes poverty and rewards luck, then you need to do more than just watch. Like this video if you believe dignity shouldn't depend on your bank account. Comment below with your thoughts, your experiences, your commitment to being part of the change. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss the other stories we need to tell, the other truths we need to speak. Share this video with everyone you know because stories change minds and change minds change systems. And check the description for real organizations doing real work to support people facing medical debt, eviction, poverty, and all the circumstances that should trigger support instead of judgment. Marcus Chen was one person who got help, but there are millions more who need it. And whether they get it depends on whether we build the systems, demand the policies, create the culture where help is guaranteed instead of dependent on luck and viral moments and guilty billionaires. Eleanor Whitmore believed in seeing people clearly, in treating everyone with dignity, in small acts of kindness that acknowledged shared humanity. Let's make that more than one woman's individual ethic. Let's make it the foundation of how we structure our entire society. That's the real ending. Not Marcus's salvation, but our collective commitment to making sure the next Marcus doesn't need salvation because the systems already work. And that starts with you. Right now, choosing to care, choosing to act, choosing to build something better. Eleanor would be proud. Marcus would be grateful. And the next person facing impossible circumstances might just make it through. That's the story. That's the truth. That's what matters. Now go make it real.